Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. Last episode, we built the lift bridge, inspired by Duluth's famous aerial lift bridge, and today we're going to be jumping over to the other side of the canal and beginning on an area inspired by Duluth's Canal Park, which is an old warehouse district that has been remodeled and reshaped into a modern-day tourist district. We're not going to fill this entire point of land today, but we're going to get started and do the main bulk of the density with all the shops and restaurants, and we're also going to begin to set up the city's streetcar network. I'm going to start by adding a very simple grid system. We just have a couple of parallel avenues running the length of the point here, and then a couple of perpendicular streets as well. On one of these, I'm going to add the terminus of the streetcar line that's going to run down this area. Duluth had a streetcar system from 1883 to 1939, and it was eventually replaced by a bus system. I want to imagine in Amaranth that they kept this system around, at least in part. Some lines have been added, some have been changed or removed, but despite any of the changes and modernizations, there's been continuous streetcar usage in the city for the last 140, 150 years. So there's just going to be a single line running out into this district. Right now, I'm only laying down the tracks because I kind of need to know where the tracks are going to go as we put down the road network. We're going to add the actual transit line itself later once we put down all the buildings, and we kind of need to know where these stops are best placed. I'm also adding this key to the southern end of the peninsula so that we have a nice clean line bounding in the area we need to fill in. Now we're going to start to place some buildings. I'm not too sure if these are like old warehouses or factories that have been repurposed as commercial buildings, or if they're more modern developments meant to just fit into the architectural style of the area. But either way, I'm going to select assets that tend toward that kind of brick warehouse look. Around back, we have a giant parking lot. That's going to be a running theme over the next couple episodes as we fill this area in, is we're going to make these relatively dense buildings and then thin it out with some parking lots, of course, taking inspiration from the real place. I am using these big parking lot roads, which I mentioned last episode I was still getting used to, and that's still the case here. I kind of do it completely wrong here, so I end up putting the parking spaces on top of the driving lanes so people drive through the parking spaces. I'm not too worried about that, but I am going to try to improve that as we go through the series. I'm also going to try to not show too many of the same repetitive style of parking lot over and over again, so I'm generally not going to linger on these parts of the builds too much, but I did want to mention the kinds of techniques and mistakes I made when initially trying to figure out how to use these. My usual technique will tend to be just kind of not worry too much about how it looks before all the detailing, and then fix any problems and clipping and other issues like that show up with the detailing, putting grass edges around the edge of the parking lots and decals on top kind of helps blend together any of the textural issues that arise. Going pretty easy on the detailing to begin, just trying to ease myself in, getting used to a new set of assets, a new collection of mods, and all that stuff. So this first block is not the most detailed ever, but we do have some interesting things like this fence along the parking lot. I don't usually think parking lots like this are fenced in, but I think it looks kind of nice separating the parking lot from the waterfront. Now, for the bulk of the buildings in this area, they're going to be these smaller 1 or 2 wide buildings that go 2 to 4 deep. And I'm thinking this probably wouldn't have been original architecture in a warehouse district. Maybe some of them are, I don't know. But generally, I'm going to try to mix in some slightly more modern looking buildings, or buildings that look older and maybe have been made in imitation of an older style. I'm not too knowledgeable about architecture in this area or in general, but I'm going to try to have at least some sort of consistency or logic behind which buildings I put down. Here's another big parking lot, which I actually managed to properly assemble. And then there's quite a bit of empty space back here that is somehow not taken over by the parking lot. So I'm going to add a little patio for this area. I think it's maybe like a small shopping center with a couple of restaurants or something, and they could have a consolidated seating area out back. I have this really weird bug with PO where when I drag something along an axis to copy it, the original disappears while I'm dragging it, and then it reappears once I place the copied object, which is really annoying because usually I use that because I need to line things up in a row, and you can't really do that if the initial object disappears. Haven't figured out what causes that or how to fix it. If anybody knows, please let me know. I hope I don't sound like I'm complaining too much about having a new mod list or anything, because it really is fun to have a fully up-to-date mod list that isn't constantly breaking my game, but there are definitely some issues introduced by it. For the most part, I've been able to manage, and it feels good to be able to get into the game and load it up in like 3 minutes instead of half an hour like it was with Todos Santos. So overall, it's definitely a much more positive experience and much more fun to play with. Apparently this building here used to be a warehouse where goods were transferred from ship to rail. I thought that was kind of cool, so I'm going to build something kind of resembling it. Not quite a recreation, but the general arrangement of one tall building with some shorter ones on either side. Apparently the tallest building now houses a hotel, and any good hotel needs a way too big parking lot. Next, we're going to hop across the streetcar tracks and go back down to the lift bridge and work our way back down the avenue. Starting at this end with what probably would have been an old warehouse or factory of some sort, and has now been retrofitted to be the area's visitor center. I wanted the nice looking facade on the back as well, facing the parking lot, so I'm just taking a second copy with PO, getting rid of all the excess stuff so that we can just have this nice entrance there. And then we're going to connect that across the parking lot to the park. There's going to be a path running around this portion of the park eventually, and just clean up some of these details here and there, add a couple trees to spruce it up, so to speak. And finally, to make this place functional, I'm going to place an entertainment block inside this PO building since it doesn't actually attract visitors anymore. It's going to be the Amaranth Visitor Center. As you can pretty clearly see from this aerial view of Canal Park, the central strip has smaller, seemingly more modern buildings for the most part, except for one or two here and there, like this brewery that we have on the corner. The building that's close by in real life is actually on the workshop, but I didn't realize that until after I'd already finished this build. So I'm going to save that building, and we're going to put it in the downtown as part of the skyline when we eventually get to that build. But otherwise, the buildings are a lot smaller and slightly more modern. I'm thinking that this area in the center was probably some really heavy industrial stuff, or maybe just outdoor yards of some kind related to the industrial work that went on here. And so a lot of that stuff simply needed to be torn down and replaced with modern buildings. Some of them made in a more traditional style, and some of them a little bit more modern. So I'm basically just going to go around the exterior of the blocks and place down buildings according to that style that I just described, and then fill in the center with a fairly convoluted system of parking lots and areas that allow access to the back of each building. Oh, and by the way, this building on the corner here is also from Duluth. One problem I've run into with these types of buildings is that the differences in colors between mostly the brick buildings is pretty noticeable, so I generally have to go in and adjust the brightness of each of these as much as I can so that they feel like they're within a kind of standard range of color, because I don't want the brick buildings in particular to look too wildly different. And they tend to look really nice when you darken them just a little bit and really bring out that reddish brown color. So I try to do that when I can. Not every asset has that ability baked in, because there's some other color variation that function works for instead, which is totally fine, of course. But I just try to be mindful of that and adjust it when I can. As for the detailing, I'm just trying to put down enough clutter to make it look like there's some sort of activity, various deliveries, trash pickups, that kind of stuff going on at the back of each store without going too much into detail for every single building. So there's more of this kind of building to do, but first we're going to take a little break for some streetcars. I was way too excited to actually get some vehicles running around on the streetcar tracks. So instead of waiting to build it next to our Union Station, which we're going to build eventually, or in one of the industrial areas, I wanted to build it in this district. There's actually kind of a lack of small tram depot assets on the workshop, so I had to take, this is the smallest one I could find. So I took that and covered it up with some warehouse buildings turned into POs so we don't actually get a bunch of truck traffic going to and from those, and then just ran the tracks into it. It's probably a little oversized for the small number of streetcar lines that we're eventually going to have in the city, or at least that I have planned at the moment, but I think it looks kind of cool. This obviously wouldn't be the original depot from the original streetcar lines back in the 19th century, because this area would have probably been dedicated to all the industrial stuff going on in the port. But in the modern day, I'm thinking as part of the redevelopment of this area into a tourist district, part of that package would have been a new streetcar depot to manage any new expansion lines that they were adding. It did have some problems spawning the actual tram vehicles, though, and what I eventually figured out is that it seems to not like that the reversible tram stop, because I'm using the reversible tram AI mod, is the first one on the line, and there's no loop on the other end. So basically, the AI seems to think that there isn't a line for it to go to for some reason. So basically what I did is I added a temporary tram track out of the back of the depot so that they could come around and approach from the other direction, and they seemed to like that, and they started spawning. I'm using the Twin Cities light rail vehicles, which happen to be on the workshop, so I thought that was the perfect match for our modern rolling stock for our streetcar system. I'm going to decorate each stop with just a couple simple things, some planters with some nice trees, trash cans, and these stops as well, but I didn't want to just have them be blank stops. I wanted to add a little bit of branding. At first I tried making something in PO, which has a very simple image editor built into the texture editor, but it didn't quite look like what I wanted. So I decided to hop into Photoshop and make up something myself inspired by the Kansas City streetcar logo, which I mostly picked, besides being fairly close to the area we're working in, relatively speaking. It's also very simple, and I'm terrible at Photoshop, so it's something that I was actually able to create fairly quickly without too much of a headache. Back at the terminus stop and the depot building itself, I wanted to add a few more details just to make it look a little bit more tourist and pedestrian friendly, walling off the yard of the tram depot and adding some landscaping and other details to the front of the building. Finally, I'm going to add an office block into this building to represent all the administrative work that goes into the streetcar network, and an entertainment block as well, because I imagine you get tourists visiting the historic building that's attached to the front of the depot. Going back to our more standard commercial development, I'm going to build up the next block in pretty much the same style. Along the central avenue that goes down to the bridge, we have a more wall-to-wall style. And then around the back, because they don't need to present as pleasing of a facade, we have a less dense area with more access to the alleys and the parking area, which is going to appear right about now. For the very last block that we're going to fill in for the episode, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So we're starting with a small park with a Civil War memorial monument in memory of all the boys who went off to fight for the Union. It's just going to be a simple park, otherwise with a small path running through. Your typical details, like some benches, trash bins, some planters at the corners, just building these out of some jetty rocks, and then filling in the center with some planter blocks. Definitely did not mean for that to rhyme, but it did. And just enough foliage to make it seem like a nicer, more pleasant area to roam around. We have pretty much the same style of foliage within the planters, the yellow flowers with these small trees. And then there are some clusters of evergreens and cottonwoods as well, just more or less randomly across the park, including a big line of them around back to separate it from the area that we're going to build next to finish out the episode. Oh, and I also thought I'd add a couple of desire paths around here in these pathways that kind of naturally emerged from the detailing. Since this is supposed to be a tourist district, I thought there were just a couple of things that were missing. First of all is a brew pub here along the main avenue, and then around back, we're going to have a gas station. Much like the alleyways and parking lots we made earlier, this is really just kind of around back, so it doesn't need to be too attractive. So it's just going to pretty much be a plain area of concrete with a few details here and there to hopefully bring it to life. And with these details just about done, I'm just going to detail up this little loading area here for the brewery. I want to say thank you so much for watching the second episode of Amaranth Bay. I hope you enjoyed, and I really hope to see you in the next one and the many episodes to come after that. See ya.